welcome back. We're ready for the next step in our reed making process here with cane prep. I've got two different ways that I'm going to show you how to shape the cane today. So shaping is the process of taking the cane from this rectangle to having an outline of what we might expect from a finished reed. So it works like an inverted cookie cutter, right? We're going to take off all of the stuff that's not the shape of the reed that we want ultimately. And there are really two different kinds of tools that we use in bassoon reed making to do that. They're both called shapers. One is a straight shaper because the cane remains straight throughout inside this device. The other one's called a folding shaper because you fold the shape over the tip. Now, I have students and young professionals all the time ask me which one should they use and which one and why. And ultimately, what you want to make that decision on is what the actual dimensions are of the shape. But I do find that in early reed making, we end up making some decisions based on either availability of material. So your university or your school owns a folding shaper, your teacher owns a straight shaper or something, and that becomes the one that you use. But ultimately those are kind of based on the shape themselves. And some people find that it's just a little bit easier to use some logistically. You're less likely to cut your hand or something like that. So use the one initially that you feel safest with and that you're able to make the kind of shape reed that you want to. So I'm going to show you first the straight shaper. This is what I use. I use a straight shaper because of the shape that I'm going for. I use a Fox 3, which is a little wider than what some of you may be playing on, but I've got kind of a big bassoon and a big approach to playing the bassoon, and so it works really well to have that really wide throat for me. For a straight shaper, the cane slides in between the two halves of this template, and what I'm going to do to select how far that goes, because I've got a little bit of leeway on both sides, is I actually just hold this cane up to the light. And it's a little hard to see in here, but I hold up to the light to make sure that if I have any dense lines or if the center of the gouge, right, depending on what kind of gouger you're using, the center of the gouge is right in the center of the cane, and it is on this one, so I can just line it up straight in the middle, tighten down, and then I use a nice sharp razor blade to carve away everything that's not inside that template. The thing to remember about shaping in both, no matter if you're using a straight shaper or a folding shaper, is that there's a point in which the taper changes. Right? The reed gets more and more narrow right here to the throat, and then it gets wider and wider. So when I'm cutting, I actually cut in both directions so that I approach that turnaround and do what I call back cutting, slide the razor blade back up. So I start toward the widest part. I try to aim for about a toothpick amount the first few passes, getting more and more getting smaller and smaller rather, as I get closer to the template. And then I can go right along the shaper, slide up to where that back cut is, which is right about where the second wire goes. Pretty close. Right, so right there, and then I back cut and slide backwards. And resist the temptation, friends, those of you that are type A like I am, to grab this and pull this off, because there are pieces of cane that are approaching that back cut, and if I do that, then I'll have a slice that goes right up into the blade of the reed, or that cuts down into the tube. And at this point, you see I'm actually using kind of a considerable amount of force with the razor blade flush against the shaper. And the reason for that is I want this to be exactly the shape of the shaper, no more, no less, but I don't want to use anything abrasive that would potentially change the shape of the shaper. If you do something like using a sandpaper to rub up against this and really get a flush shape, then over time the sandpaper can actually change the shape of your shaper, and your reeds get a tiny bit more narrow every time you do that until you're not playing on the same shape reeds anymore. So I back cut, slide down to the point where I need a back cut and stop, slide back up, stop, and kind of inch forward until I'm flush. Do a couple passes with what I would do with sandpaper. I should be able to rub my finger along this whole edge without any risk of splinter. So I cut all the way through. And if your razor blade rather, is nice and sharp, then this is like butter. It just flies right by. If you're starting in the shaping process and you're pretty new to this process of cane preparation, then this is going to take you a little bit more time. Now you can see how it looks like it would be really easy for me to lose control corner of the razor blade goes into this meaty part of my thumb. I think shaping is the stage in which I personally have sustained the most reed-making injuries, and which my students have as well. Right, so be very, very careful with the razor blade. Now I have a piece of cane that is flush. I do this dry, which may or may not be popular for straight shaping. I do it dry because I feel like then I don't have any weird compression with the cane, and I can get a really clean cut. And I do it before I've profiled, because this cane holds up, as it's a little bit thicker, it holds up a little bit better to that shearing or that side scraping motion, since it's not going to be doubled up like it will over the folding shaper. So I do this straight shaping, dry, after gouging but before profiling. So this will go in the water and get ready for profiling. And then I will have a gouge shaped and profiled piece of cane. If I want to use the folding shaper, the cane needs to be wet so it can fold without breaking. The cane also needs to be very thin so that it can fold again without breaking. And so I do this with soaked cane after I've profiled. So the starting point for folding shaping is a profiled piece of cane that is soaked. And I fold this in half. If it's been nicely perforated by your profiler, then you won't have to have too much of an issue folding that. But you may have to fold it over a straight edge, or find that center, line it up with the tip of your shaper, and fold over the top of that. In the same process, if I hold that up to the light, I'm looking for the densest part to make sure it's straight in the center. Then I loosen these little arms, slide it up into place. Tighten them down. And now I'm ready to repeat that same process, but I'll do 2 pieces of cane at once, both sides of the blade, approaching the center. The benefit of this, when you have the cane that's already pre-folded in half, is that you're positive that you're scraping the same on both sides. So the top and bottom blade will match because you're cutting them with the same stroke. Again, I use these really tiny shaving motions. Very close to the template, freeze before that back cut, and push back. I'm a little less proficient at this because I do this one less frequently. I need to tighten my shaper down. This is one of the difficulties I find with folding shapers, is that sometimes they get a little slippery. But you scrape away the outside, and we're left with a nicely shaped piece of cane. So at the end of this step, I will have a gouge-shaped and profiled piece of cane because I profiled before I shaped. So even though we call all cane GSP, gouge-shaped and profiled, it doesn't necessarily mean that they went through all stages of the process in the same order. Gouging always comes first, but your shaping and profiling might mix and match depending on what type of shaper you use. Profilers can take any shaped piece of cane, so you don't need to make that kind of decision based on your profiler. It will be only based on your shaper. So I've got one side done. Again, these little tiny little scrapes. A lot of folding shapers will have a little rectangular metal piece here that's a hand guard, which can be really helpful as you're getting used to this process. You can notice it can be kind of forceful if your blade starts getting dull. So of all the times in reed making life, to use a really sharp blade, this is for sure one of them. Slide this along the template, nice and flush. And when we're done, you can see we have a gouge-shaped and profiled piece of cane. Take this out of the shaper. Eject it out of the shaper. And it's ready to make a reed. So both of these will end up with reeds that are ready, or reeds that are in the proper shape. Cane that's put in the proper shape to become a reed, rather. But this one has already been profiled, and this one still has yet to be profiled. So I'll drop that guy back in the water, so we'll have 2 matching pieces of cane by the end of the process.